They called her useless, but Clara Whitmore possessed a mind that could track patterns others missed entirely. The autumn wind swept across the dusty platform of Copper Ridge Station, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain, as she clutched her single carpetbag with trembling fingers. Her would-be husband had taken one look at her clumsy attempt to serve his morning coffee, watched her fumble with the simple task of mending his torn shirt, and declared her the most impractical woman he'd ever encountered. Now she stood alone on the platform, watching the last remnants of her dignity disappear with the departing train's black smoke. The frontier town stretched before her like a harsh judgment, all weathered with insuspicious glances. Clara had arrived 3 days ago as a mail-order bride full of hopeful determination, only to be dismissed as quickly as yesterday's newspaper. Her Eastern education meant nothing here, where a woman's worth was measured by her ability to cook, clean, and keep house without complaint. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Your comment helps our community grow stronger. Thanks, and let's get back to the story. The boarding house proprietor, Mrs. Henderson, had made it clear that Clara's welcome would expire with the week's rent money. The other women in town whispered behind gloved hands about the useless Eastern girl who couldn't even properly churn butter. Clara had overheard them at the general store, their voices carrying the particular cruelty that comes from those who believe they've found someone beneath them in the social order. But on this particular morning, as Clara sat on the boarding house porch watching the sun paint the distant mesas in shades of copper and gold, something shifted in the quality of light filtering through the cottonwood leaves. A man approached on foot, moving with the kind of quiet purpose that made her lift her head from her hands. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that caught the morning light and skin weathered by sun and wind. Most striking were his eyes, dark and thoughtful, that seemed to take in everything without making judgments. This was Joseph Running Bear, though Clara wouldn't learn his name for several more minutes. The townspeople called him Joe when they needed his services, which was often, since he possessed the rare ability to read sign that others couldn't even see. He worked as a tracker for the territorial marshal, finding lost travelers, stolen livestock, and occasionally, people who didn't want to be found. Joe had noticed Clara several times over the past few days, not because she was particularly remarkable to look at, but because of the way she observed things. While other people rushed past the everyday details of frontier life, Clara lingered. She watched how the morning shadows fell across the street, how the wind moved through different types of vegetation, how people's voices changed when they were lying or afraid. She possessed the kind of attention that made for natural tracking, though she didn't know it yet. "You're the woman they're calling useless," Joe said, settling onto the porch step without invitation. His voice carried no judgment, just a statement of observed fact. Clara's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but she met his gaze steadily. "I suppose I am. Though I prefer Clara Whitmore, if names matter to you." "They do." Joe studied her for a long moment. "What do you see when you look at that ridge line over there?" Clara followed his gesture to the red rock formations rising beyond the town's edge. Most people would have seen simply rocks and sky, but Clara's educated mind automatically began cataloging details. The light hits differently on the north face than the south. There's vegetation growing in patterns that suggest water runs down from that high point during storms. The color variations in the stone layers tell a story about how long it took to form. She paused, suddenly self-conscious. "Why do you ask?" "Because most people look at those rocks and see nothing but rocks. You see the stories they tell." Joe's expression remained neutral, but something had shifted in his attention. "What do you see when you look at the people in this town?" This was a more dangerous question, but Clara found herself answering honestly. "Mrs. Henderson has calloused hands but soft palms, which means she works hard but not at rough labor. She's probably been a boarding housekeeper for many years. Mr. Garrett at the store touches his left vest pocket whenever someone mentions money, which suggests he keeps something valuable there, maybe papers or coins he's worried about losing. The blacksmith's apprentice has burn scars in specific patterns that tell me he's left-handed and still learning, because the burns are where a right-handed teacher would expect them to be." Joe listened without interruption, his dark eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he asked, "And what do people see when they look at you?" "A useless Eastern woman who can't perform the most basic household tasks without making a mess," Clara replied with bitter honesty. "That's what they think they see. What do you think they're actually seeing?" Clara considered this carefully. It was the first time anyone had asked her to think about the difference between appearance and reality regarding herself. Someone who doesn't fit their expectations of what a woman should be able to do. "And what do you think you're actually capable of doing?" The question hung in the morning air like pollen dust, heavy with possibilities Clara had never been asked to consider. She thought about her education, her ability to read and analyze, her natural curiosity about how things worked and why people behaved as they did. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never been allowed to find out." Joe stood, brushing dust from his pants. "Marshall Thompson needs help tracking some missing cattle. The thieves are smart, covering their trail in ways that are fooling the regular trackers. You interested in learning something that might actually use that mind of yours?" Clara stared at him. "You want me to help track cattle thieves?" "I want you to help me read sign. Different kind of reading than you're used to, but reading all the same." The offer was so unexpected, so far from anything Clara had imagined possible, that she almost refused out of pure shock. But something in Joe's calm certainty made her reconsider. What did she have to lose? Her reputation was already in ruins, her prospects non-existent. She could continue sitting on this porch waiting for her money to run out, or she could discover whether Joe Running Bear saw something in her that everyone else had missed. "When do we start?" she asked. "Now." They walked together to the marshal's office, where Clara met Thompson, a gruff man in his 50s who looked skeptical about Joe's suggestion to bring along the useless Eastern woman. But Thompson trusted Joe's judgment more than he trusted his own prejudices, so he agreed to let Clara observe while Joe examined the scene of the latest theft. The Peterson Ranch lay 5 miles outside town, accessible by a wagon road that wound through increasingly wild country. Clara rode beside Joe in his wagon, acutely aware that this was the first time she'd been alone with a man who wasn't trying to evaluate her domestic potential. Instead, Joe talked about reading landscape, about how every living thing left traces of its passage for those who knew how to look. "Ground tells stories," he explained as they drove. "But you have to learn its language. Same as learning to read books, except the alphabet is made of footprints, broken twigs, disturbed stones, places where the light falls differently because something passed through." At the Peterson Ranch, Clara watched Joe examine the area where 15 head of cattle had disappeared 3 nights ago. He moved slowly, systematically, his attention focused on details that seemed invisible to her untrained eye. But as he worked, explaining what he saw, Clara began to understand that this was indeed a form of reading, requiring the same kind of pattern recognition and logical analysis that had made her excel in her studies back east. "See here," Joe said, crouching beside what looked like unmarked dirt to Clara. 2 different horses, one shod, one not. The shod horse is carrying a heavier rider, probably the leader. The unshod horse has a slight favor in its left front hoof, old injury that makes the animal step differently. Clara knelt beside him, studying the ground until she began to see the subtle differences he pointed out. "How can you tell about the injury? Pattern of the prints. See how this hoof digs in at a slightly different angle? Horse is compensating for old pain." Joe looked at her carefully. "What do you notice about the direction they headed?" Clara studied the faint trail, applying the same analytical thinking she'd used for her academic work. "They're not going straight toward any obvious destination. The path curves back on itself in places, like they're trying to confuse anyone following." "Good. What else?" She concentrated harder, trying to see what story the disturbed earth might tell. "The spacing between the hoof prints changes. Sometimes closer together, sometimes farther apart. That means they varied their speed, walking sometimes, trotting others. Why would they do that?" Clara thought about it logically. To make it harder to track how many animals they were driving? Or maybe to confuse anyone trying to figure out how far ahead they might be. Joe nodded approvingly. "You're thinking like a tracker. Most people see a trail and assume it tells one simple story. Real tracking means understanding that smart quarry tries to tell false stories." They spent the rest of the morning following the thieves' trail, with Joe teaching Clara to read the subtle signs that revealed the rustler's strategy. Clara discovered that her mind, trained to analyze complex texts and identify patterns in historical documents, adapted readily to this different kind of detective work. The landscape became a manuscript written in a language she was rapidly learning to decipher. By afternoon, they had tracked the stolen cattle to a narrow canyon where the trail became more difficult to follow. The thieves had driven the animals through a creek bed, using the running water to wash away their tracks. But Joe showed Clara how to look for other signs: disturbed vegetation along the banks, stones displaced by hooves, even the way mud had been stirred up in particular patterns. "They're smart," Joe observed, studying the area where the cattle had been driven up out of the creek. "But they made one mistake." "What kind of mistake?" Clara asked. "Look at the vegetation on both sides of where they came up. What do you see?" Clara examined the plants carefully, applying the same attention to detail she'd used earlier. "The grass is bent down on the left side, but on the right side, some of the smaller bushes are broken off entirely." Which tells us what? That they had trouble controlling the cattle at this point? Maybe the animals didn't want to climb up the bank, so the rustlers had to push them harder on one side than the other? Exactly. And what does that tell us about the rustlers themselves? Clara thought about the implications. They're not experienced cattle drivers. Professional rustlers would know how to move animals smoothly without creating unnecessary disturbance. So we're probably looking for amateurs. Maybe local men who decided to try their hand at theft, rather than experienced criminals. This realization changed everything about their tracking strategy. Instead of following a trail that experienced rustlers might have laid to lead them astray, they could think about where local amateurs might take stolen cattle. Clara found herself contributing ideas about hiding places and routes that made sense from the perspective of people who knew the local area but lacked professional criminal expertise. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, painting the canyon walls in shades of rose and gold, Clara realized that for the first time since arriving in Copper Ridge, she felt genuinely useful. Her mind was engaged, her observations valued, her contributions meaningful. Joe treated her as a partner rather than a burden, listening to her ideas and building upon them rather than dismissing them. "We'll make camp here tonight," Joe decided as they reached a sheltered spot where a previous flash flood had carved out a natural windbreak. "Pick up the trail again at first light when the tracking will be easier." Clara had never spent a night outdoors, but she found herself looking forward to the experience rather than dreading it. Joe built a small fire with practiced efficiency, while Clara gathered suitable stones to create a fire ring, applying the same methodical approach she used for everything else. As they shared a simple meal of hardtack and jerky, Clara asked, "Why did you invite me to help with this?" Joe considered the question while staring into the flames. "Been watching you since you arrived. Saw how you notice things others miss. Seemed like tracking might suit you better than trying to fit into someone else's idea of what you should be. But I'm completely inexperienced. I don't know anything about this kind of work. Experience comes with practice. Natural ability is rarer." Joe looked at her directly. "You see patterns, make connections, think through problems logically. Those are the skills that matter most in tracking. The people in town think I'm useless because I can't cook or clean properly. The people in town measure worth by narrow standards. There are many ways to be useful in this world." Clara stared into the fire, thinking about the day's discoveries. For 28 years, she had accepted other people's definitions of her value, trying unsuccessfully to mold herself into shapes that didn't fit her natural abilities. Today, for the first time, she had experienced what it felt like to use her mind in ways that felt authentic and effective. "What if we don't find the cattle?" she asked. "Then we learn something from the failure and try a different approach next time." Joe replied matter-of-factly. "You think there'll be a next time?" "That Marshall Thompson would let me help again. Depends on how well you do tomorrow. But I think you'll do fine." Clara slept better that night, wrapped in Joe's spare blanket under a canopy of stars, than she had in any bed since arriving in Copper Ridge. She dreamed of landscapes that told stories, of trails that led somewhere meaningful, of a version of herself that was valued for her mind rather than dismissed for her domestic shortcomings. Dawn came with the kind of crystalline clarity that makes desert mornings feel like the world has been washed clean overnight. Clara woke to the smell of coffee brewing over the rekindled fire and the sound of Joe moving quietly around their camp. She felt more rested and alert than she had in months. "Ready to finish this?" Joe asked, offering her a cup of strong coffee and a piece of hardtack. "More than ready." They resumed tracking at first light, following the trail of the stolen cattle deeper into canyon country. Clara's developing skills allowed her to spot sign that would have been invisible to her just 24 hours earlier. She noticed where individual animals had stopped to graze, where the rustlers had rested their horses, where the group had split briefly before rejoining. "They're getting careless," Clara observed, pointing to a stretch where the cattle had been allowed to spread out and forage. "Yesterday they were careful to keep the animals bunched tight, harder to track. Now they're letting them wander. What does that suggest? That they think they're far enough from town that no one will follow. Or maybe they're getting tired of the work and not maintaining their vigilance." Joe smiled, the first time Clara had seen him show such clear approval. "You're learning to think like prey and predator both. Good tracker needs to understand the mind of whatever they're following." By mid-morning, they found the stolen cattle in a box canyon that provided natural fencing on 3 sides. 2 men sat beside a dying campfire, looking like they hadn't slept well. Clara recognized them as the Mallory brothers, young men who worked sporadically at various ranches around the area but had never shown much aptitude for steady employment. "Stay back while I talk to them," Joe instructed Clara. This could get complicated. But the confrontation proved anticlimactic. The Mallory brothers, faced with Joe's quiet certainty and the evidence of their trail, admitted to the theft without much resistance. They claimed they'd planned to sell the cattle in the next county and split the money, but neither seemed to have thought through the practical details of their criminal enterprise. "We didn't think anyone could track us this far," the older brother complained as Joe tied their hands for the journey back to town. "Your mistake was assuming no one would bother to learn your trail," Joe replied calmly. "Miss Whitmore here read your sign like a book." Clara felt a flush of pride at being credited with the successful tracking, even though she knew Joe had done most of the actual work. But she also recognized that she had contributed meaningfully to their success, applying her analytical abilities in ways that had made a genuine difference. The return journey to Copper Ridge took most of the day, with the stolen cattle and captured rustlers slowing their progress considerably. But Clara found herself enjoying even the tedious aspects of the work. She was learning to read the landscape constantly now, noticing details about weather patterns, animal behavior, and human activity that enriched her understanding of the country around her. When they arrived in town as the sun was setting, a small crowd gathered to see the returned cattle and captured thieves. Marshall Thompson looked genuinely impressed, and several townspeople who had previously dismissed Clara as useless now regarded her with puzzled curiosity. "How'd you manage to track them all the way into the canyon country?" Thompson asked Joe. "Miss Whitmore has natural ability for reading sign," Joe replied, giving Clara full credit. "Saw things I might have missed on my own." The praise felt genuine rather than patronizing, based on actual contribution rather than politeness. Clara realized that this was the first time in her adult life that someone had publicly acknowledged her competence at something that mattered. Mrs. Henderson approached as the crowd began to disperse. "Clara, dear, I heard about your adventure. How exciting that you helped catch those cattle thieves." The change in Mrs. Henderson's tone was subtle but unmistakable. Where before there had been barely concealed disapproval, now Clara detected something like respect. It was a small shift, but Clara had learned to read human behavior with the same attention she now applied to tracking. "It was educational," Clara replied diplomatically. "Well, you'll have quite a story to tell. I'm sure the other ladies will want to hear all about it." Clara doubted the other ladies would suddenly accept her based on one successful tracking expedition, but she appreciated that Mrs. Henderson was making an effort to include her in the social fabric of the town. That evening, Jo walked Clara back to the boarding house through streets that felt different now that she had proven herself capable of meaningful work. The familiar buildings and faces seemed less judgmental, more simply part of a community she might actually belong to. What happens next? Clara asked as they reached the boarding house porch. Marshall has more work for trackers, if you're interested. Won't all be as straightforward as the Mallory brothers, but it's steady employment for someone with the right skills. You think I have the right skills? I think you have skills that most people never get the chance to develop. Question is whether you want to develop them further. Clara thought about her alternatives. She could continue trying to find a husband who would accept her domestic limitations, or she could explore this unexpected path that seemed to value her natural abilities. The choice felt momentous, like stepping off a familiar trail into unmapped territory. I'd like to learn more, she said. Good. We'll start with some basic survival skills, since tracking work often means spending time in rough country. Then we'll work on different types of sign reading, maybe some basic investigation techniques. You'd be willing to teach me all that? Got to pass along what I know to someone. You seem like a good candidate. Over the following weeks, Clara's life transformed in ways she could never have imagined. Jo taught her to read weather signs, to find water in dry country, to move quietly through different types of terrain. She learned to identify the tracks of various animals, to understand how different weather conditions affected sign, to think through the logical implications of what she observed. More importantly, Clara learned to trust her own judgment in ways she never had before. When Jo asked her opinion about a trail or a possible hiding place, she discovered that her analytical thinking often led to insights that proved valuable. Her confidence grew with each successful tracking expedition, each problem solved through careful observation and logical deduction. The transformation didn't go unnoticed in Copper Ridge. People who had previously dismissed Clara as the useless Eastern woman began to greet her with curiosity and respect. When Mrs. Peterson's youngest son went missing during a storm, it was Clara who found the clues that led to his safe recovery. When someone broke into the church and stole the collection money, Clara's analysis of the evidence helped identify the culprit. But the most significant change was in how Clara saw herself. For the first time in her life, she felt that her natural abilities were valued rather than seen as deficiencies. Her mind, which had been criticized for being too analytical, too curious, too unwilling to accept simple answers, became her greatest asset. Jo proved to be a patient and skilled teacher, sharing not just tracking techniques but also his broader understanding of how to read people and situations. Clara learned that his quiet observation style masked a deep intelligence and a generous spirit that valued competence over conformity. Their working partnership gradually developed into something deeper. Jo never made Clara feel that she needed to choose between her growing skills and conventional feminine roles. Instead, he seemed to appreciate her exactly as she was, complicated analytical mind and all. One evening in late autumn, as they returned from a successful search for some missing horses, Clara realized that she had found something she had never dared to hope for, a place where she belonged exactly as she was, and a person who valued her for her authentic self rather than some imagined version of who she should be. I never thanked you properly, Clara said as they unsaddled their horses at the stable behind the marshal's office. For what? For seeing something in me that I didn't know was there. For giving me a chance to discover what I'm actually capable of. Jo considered this while hanging up his saddle. Didn't give you anything that wasn't already yours. Just helped you find it. Still, I'm grateful. For the first time in my life, I feel useful. Actually useful, not just trying to fit someone else's definition of usefulness. Good thing, because the territory needs more people who can think clearly and see what others miss. Too much country out here, too few people with real tracking skills. Clara looked out at the vast landscape visible through the stable doors, no longer seeing it as harsh and unwelcoming but as full of stories waiting to be read, problems waiting to be solved, meaningful work waiting to be done. I think I'm going to like it here, she said. I think you are too. As winter settled over Copper Ridge, Clara found herself established not as the useless Eastern woman who couldn't perform domestic tasks, but as a skilled tracker whose analytical abilities had proven invaluable to the community. She had discovered that worth wasn't measured by how well you fit predetermined roles, but by how effectively you could contribute your unique abilities to the common good. The woman they had once called useless had found her true value in the vast spaces of the frontier, where her mind could roam as freely as the wind across the desert, and where a quiet Navajo tracker had seen her potential long before she saw it herself. Clara Whitmore had finally found her place in the world, and it was exactly where she belonged. Before you go, take a moment to reflect on Clara's journey from feeling useless to discovering her true worth. Have you ever felt undervalued for not fitting into expected roles? Sometimes our greatest strengths are hidden until someone sees us clearly and helps us recognize what we're truly capable of achieving.